Let's just dive right into this explainer because we are going to completely shatter everything you thought you knew about where writers actually come from. Seriously, think about the books on your shelf right now, or even the articles you scrolled through this morning. Every single one has a name attached to it, right? But here's the crazy part. That wasn't always the case. Today we're going way, way back to trace the ancient mythological origins of authorship. We're stepping totally outside our modern assumptions to uncover a time when putting words together was seen as something entirely different.
So before we get into the real nuts and bolts here, ask yourself a super simple but honestly profound question. Who actually invented the concept of claiming a text as their own? I mean, for thousands of years, humans told stories, passed down myths around the fire, and eventually wrote things down. But the earliest literary works we know of? Totally anonymous. Epic myths were carved into stone, but no single person took credit for them. They were just part of the cultural fabric. So at some point in human history, someone had to break that mold, right? Someone literally had to step forward and say, hey, I made this. These are my words.
And what's really fascinating here is the massive contrast between our modern ideal of the solitary genius and the ancient reality of authorship. Today, when we think of an author, we naturally picture someone locked in a room, sitting at a desk, just conjuring up brilliant ideas out of thin air, right? Creating something from absolutely nothing. But in the ancient world, no way. An author wasn't viewed as this magical creator making things from scratch. Instead, they were seen as a deeply mediated, collaborative participant. They were a channel. The prevailing belief was basically that words and stories already existed out there in the universe, usually hanging out with the gods, and the author's main job was simply to catch those profound truths and pass them on to the rest of us.
To really wrap our heads around this profound shift, we have to meet an absolute pioneer. Meet Enheduanna. She was a 23rd century BCE old Akkadian princess and a high priestess from ancient Iraq. And just to put that into perspective, being a high priestess in ancient Mesopotamia meant she wielded immense political and spiritual power. We're talking about one of the most important figures of her entire era, but she is also the very first known author in world literature. She's going to serve as our anchor for this explainer. And what's so absolutely crucial about Enheduanna isn't just that we finally have a name attached to a text. It's the wild story she tells about how she became an author in the first place.
Take her most famous work, The Exaltation. This wasn't written in some quiet, cozy room alone. Not at all. It was actually composed through a desperate, magical, middle-of-the-night dialogue with the powerful goddess Inanna. You see, Enheduanna had just been stripped of her position and thrown into exile by a political usurper. Imagine this scene. It's the dead of night, in a place she called the Holy Inn, and she's desperately reaching out to the goddess. She's pouring her heart out, trying to convince Inanna to step in and restore her to power. So the poem we have today, it didn't just document that moment. It literally emerged directly out of that intense, intimate communion between a desperate priestess and a deity.
And this brilliantly illustrates how their identities effectively merged during the process. The text itself is so deliberately ambiguous. Like, there's a line that says, her speaking to the holy woman was overwhelming. Well, who is actually speaking there? Is the priestess exalting the goddess, or is the goddess proclaiming the restoration of her priestess? It's a total gestalt shift. The I of the narrator and the you of the goddess shift back and forth until you basically can't tell them apart. By exchanging words, they are actually making each other who they are. Enheduanna gives the goddess form and presence in the human world through her praise, and in return, the goddess gives Enheduanna her authority and her voice.
So this brings us to a really crucial concept, medial agency. Basically, this means ancient authors fundamentally saw themselves as channels for texts received from somewhere else. They definitely weren't omnipotent creators commanding words from nothing, but, and this is super important, they also weren't just passively taking dictation like some ancient tape recorder. It was a highly active, sometimes really difficult middle ground. They had to contend with these powerful divine forces. Imagine receiving this overwhelming vision. The author had to actively shape that raw divine material into human language. They had to resist the urge to just be totally consumed by it while still allowing themselves to be shaped by the experience. It was this intense wrestling match between the divine source and the human interpreter.
Now, over time, this concept of being a channel evolved into two distinct, really powerful metaphors in ancient cuneiform literature: the dreamers and the weavers. These became the two main ways ancient scribes explained this whole medial agency thing to the world. If you were an author back then, you pretty much fell into one of these two camps. You either got your text directly through a supernatural vision, or you meticulously built it out of the physical and cultural materials left behind by the people who came before you. But the key takeaway here, both of these approaches rely completely on something already existing before the author even steps onto the stage. Okay, let's look at the dreamers first. the Babylonian author Kabti-Ilyam-Marduk, which, by the way, is a name that still commands massive respect in ancient literature. He perfectly embodies this trope. He actually claimed that the god Era revealed an entire epic to him in a dream, and when he woke up, he simply relayed it verbatim. He says he neglected nothing, nor did he add a single line to it. Just look at the incredible dynamic happening here. The author is positioned perfectly in the middle. He's exactly halfway between the night and the day, and halfway between the immortal gods and mortal humans. He gets the divine inspiration in the dark isolation of sleep, and then acts as this crucial channel to broadcast it clearly to the human audience in the light of day.
But honestly, the weaver trope is equally mind-blowing, especially when you realize just how much of our modern literary vocabulary literally comes from ancient textile labor. Think about the words we use every single day. The Latin word text, it literally translates to woven. The word carmen, which means a song, also doubles as a carding instrument used for preparing wool. Over in Greek, a rhapsody translates to a song sewn together. And hiphos means both a web and a text. I mean, authorship as a form of weaving is embedded so deeply in the DNA of our language that we are literally invoking ancient textile labor every single time we send a text message today. The ancient author wasn't pulling ideas from the ether, they were actively working a loom of language.
Bringing it back to our anchor, Enheduanna herself was actually proudly referred to as a weaver of tablets. She didn't produce her threads from nothing, spinning them out of her own body like a spider. Far from it. Instead, she took older materials and uniquely patterned them into something completely unprecedented. When she boasts in her writing that she has created something no one had created before, she doesn't mean she invented the raw vocabulary or the mythology out of thin air. No, she meant that she took those heavy, resistant threads of ancient, established traditions, put them on her loom, and crossed them in ways no one had ever dared to before. She created a brand new, intricate, and beautiful pattern.
And all of this brings us to a really beautiful realization. Ancient authorship was fundamentally a collective creation. It required this strict, multi-step chain of custody to actually come to life. Let's trace that path, right? First, you have the divine revelation, the God's inspiration. Second comes the author's translation, the actual weaving of the text into human language. But it doesn't stop there. Third, it depended entirely on a singer's public recitation to give those words actual breath and sound. And finally, it only survived through the scribe's careful circulation, painstakingly copying the tablets for future generations. Think about it. Enheduanna's magical nighttime conversation, it's completely unresolved until the singer actually performs the poem publicly the very next day. Without the singer's voice, or the scribe's hand, the author essentially doesn't exist.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a thought to ponder. If all creativity is just a collaborative remixing of pre-existing threads, well, who's the true author of the words we write today? Think about your own life for a second. When you write an email, compose a song, or even draft a presentation for work, are you truly the solitary creator you've always been taught to be? Or are you simply the latest mediator, a modern dreamer and weaver, pulling on the exact same ancient threads that Enheduanna picked up thousands of years ago? Take a moment and really let that sink in. It's definitely something to chew on the next time you sit down to create. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey into the ancient past.